The man from the feed store came at dusk. He didn't knock. He stood on the porch long enough for the birds to announce him, then waited until I opened the door myself. He was older than I'd thought. Shoulders bowed forward not by age, but by habit, like someone used to leaning into posture. He didn't look at the house when he spoke. They said you'd last longer, he told me. That's a problem. I asked him who they were. People who don't live here anymore, he said. People who thought they could rotate it faster. He stepped inside without asking. The scream responded immediately, sharpening, pulling upward toward the hallway like a wire drawn tight. He winced but didn't react beyond that. See, he said, it knows the difference. He led me to the kitchen table and laid out papers, not deeds, not contracts, calendars, names written in pencil, lines crossed through them, arrows pointing forward. Each page showed a sequence of occupants, overlapping stays, deliberate gaps that never exceeded a specific number of days. They used to swap every few months, he said. Didn't work. Then weeks. Didn't work. Now it's when it lets us. I asked him what happened to the ones who stayed too long. He rubbed his left wrist unconsciously, fingers pressing into scar tissue I hadn't noticed before. They stopped leaving cleanly, he said. That night he stayed, not upstairs, not beneath the stairs, on the porch. He sat with his back against the front door, boots planted wide, jaw clenched as the scream adjusted itself to include him. The sound broadened, stretched thin between us, like it was being forced to share attention. The house strained. Beams groaned in protest. The pressure surged and dipped erratically, unable to settle. The scream wavered, broke rhythm, spiked unpredictably. This wasn't allowed. By midnight, the man was shaking. His breathing went shallow, erratic, and I saw the same pressure behind his eyes I'd felt on the road. The scream began to favor me again, pulling back, concentrating, as if making a choice. He noticed. Don't move, he said through clenched teeth. It's deciding. I stayed perfectly still. The scream collapsed inward, snapping back beneath the stairs with violent force. The house steadied. The map slumped forward, gasping, sweat soaking his collar. It picked you, he said. That's not good. He left before dawn, moving stiffly, favoring his left side. As he stepped off the porch, the pressure flared briefly, then receded, like something testing whether it was allowed to follow. It wasn't. Yet. When I checked the ledger later, I found a new entry written in a hand I didn't recognize. Replacement attempt failed. Preference established. Did not introduce overlap again. Below it, someone had added, smaller, shakier. Once it chooses, it resists change. The scream that night was different, focused, patient, no longer reacting, waiting. And I understood then that this house did not trap people, it selected them. And once selected, it began planning around their eventual absence. The scream stopped waking me up. That was how I knew things were getting worse. It no longer needed volume to assert itself. The pressure stayed constant now, a low, ever-present compression that settled into my bones. Even when the house was quiet, I could feel it. A hum beneath the floor, steady and patient, like machinery left running in another room. I began losing time. Not hours, minutes, small, specific gaps that left no residue of sleep or distraction. I would stand in the hallway, intending to check the sealed room and find myself already there, hand resting against the enforced pegs, palm buzzing as if I'd been touching them for far longer than I remembered. The ledger explained this too, though indirectly. Entries began referencing alignment. It responds faster when routine stabilizes. Erratic behavior increases strain. Sleep proximity accelerates adjustment. One passage, written in cramped script, chilled me more than the rest. Dreaming gives it access to your scale. That night, I dreamed of the house without walls, not ruins, not collapse, absence. The structure was still present, its outline traced in pressure and sound, but the wood and plaster were gone, peeled away to reveal the shape underneath. Something vast lay coiled beneath the foundation. Its surface ridged and uneven, rising and falling in slow, deliberate motion. It was not trapped, it was crouched. When I woke, the scream was gone entirely. Panic hit hard and immediate. I ran for the sealed room, heart pounding, breath shallow, expecting rupture, collapse, escape. Instead, I found the dirt floor smoothed, not settled, smoothed. The rippling I'd seen before had resolved into shallow grooves, repeating patterns pressed into the soil as if something had been testing weight distribution. Near the center, a depression had formed, roughly human in length and width. A mold, not of me, of the space I occupied. The scream returned abruptly as I stared at it, snapping back into place like a reprimand. The house shuddered, dust raining down, beams flexing under sudden strain. I staggered backward as the pressure redistributed, locking the sound beneath the stairs again. It hadn't been silent, it had been working. That afternoon, I found changes elsewhere. Door frames subtly widened, the hallway felt longer, its proportions slightly off, like a drawing redone by someone who understood the idea of humans, but not the details. The upstairs room with the wrapped floor now held a second impression beside the first, shallower, less defined, abandoned mid-attempt. The house wasn't just containing anymore. It was adjusting its interior, preparing for something that would need to move through it. The ledger's final warning repeated in my mind, no longer abstract. Once it stops screaming, it's because it doesn't need to practice. That night, I slept sitting upright beneath the stairs, refusing to give it more of me than necessary. The scream stayed low and constant, displeased but controlled. Still, as I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, I felt something new beneath the vibration. Motion. Slow, careful, myriad against my breathing. The house creaked softly, not in protest, but in accommodation. And for the first time since I arrived in Union, I understood the true danger wasn't that the thing beneath the house would escape. It was that, eventually, it wouldn't need the house at all. By the time the town noticed something was wrong, it was already too late to pretend the house was functioning as intended. Animals stopped passing the property, not gradually, abruptly. Birds altered their flight paths, lifting higher as they crossed the road, wings beating harder as if pushing through resistance. Dogs refused to walk near the porch, straining at leashes, winning with a panic that felt rehearsed, inherited. The house was no longer containing the sound. It was radiating it. The scream began leaking outward in ways I couldn't control, not audible, structural. The pressure bled into the ground, into the road, into the air itself. I felt it when cars passed, the vibration hitching briefly as they crossed an invisible boundary and then releasing once they were clear. The feed store man returned, this time with two others. They stood together at the edge of the yard, unwilling to cross the threshold. "She's breaking pattern," one of them said. "We can feel it." I asked them what they intended to do. They didn't answer directly. Instead, they unrolled a rough map across the hood of their truck, hand-drawn, layered, corrected again and again over decades. At the center was the house. From it radiated lines, not cracks, not tunnels, but vectors, arrows pointing outward into the surrounding land. "It's not digging up," the man said quietly. "It's mapping away." The ledger never mentioned this stage, or perhaps it did and no one survived long enough to write it down. That night, the scream changed direction. It no longer pressed upward, it pulled. The vibration tugged at my balance, subtle but insistent, as if the house itself was leaning forward, trying to follow something just out of reach. The sealed room strained, planks bowing inward, nails screeching under pressure that didn't belong there. I felt it then, not beneath me, but ahead of me. The shape it had been practicing wasn't for standing, it was for passage. I went to the front room and stared at the longest wall in the house. Hairline cracks had appeared, spider webbing outward from a central point about shoulder height. The plaster there felt warm to the touch, pulsing faintly beneath my palm. A door without hinges, a boundary being negotiated. The scream dipped into a frequency that made my vision blur, and for a moment I saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough. A silhouette pressed against the inside of the wall, testing resistance, adjusting its outline, not forcing, learning. The town's mistake, I realized, had been thinking the house was a container. It was a mold, and molds don't last once the thing they shape decides it's ready. Outside, the feed store man shouted for me to get away from the wall. His voice sounded distant, distorted, like it was traveling through water. The scream surged, furious now, no longer patient. The house lurched forward on its foundation, beams screaming under sudden torque. Something inside had found the direction it wanted to go, and it was done waiting for permission. The morning light revealed changes I hadn't noticed before. The front door, the threshold I'd crossed so many times, was no longer aligned properly. Not a hinge problem, not rotting. The frame had shifted subtly, impossible to explain by settling alone. A narrow gap ran the height of the door, a slit just wide enough for something to watch, to measure, to judge without fully showing itself. I pressed my palm against it, instinctively, and felt vibration again. Not the residual pressure I'd grown used to, but active, sentient. The walls themselves seemed to hum in response, tiny shivers running along the banisters, the floorboards, the ceiling. It wasn't screaming yet, not audibly, but it was testing. I realized then that all my attempts to stabilize the room beneath the stairs, to buffer it with my presence, had failed. The thing had learned my rhythm, my breathing. The precise moments I shifted weight or blinked, every motion had been recorded, stored, and calibrated for its next move. I wanted to leave. I tried to move forward, the front door, but the house resisted. The floor pitched minutely beneath my feet, subtly enough to disturb balance, enough to force me to pause, to recalculate. The hallway stretched imperceptibly, and the door receded fractionally as if the house itself had grown taller, broader, aware of my intent. From the corner of the hallway, I heard it, a low, almost human whisper layered beneath the structural hum. Not a voice I could understand, but patterned, rhythmic, familiar, like memory echoing in a space it didn't own. I staggered back to the sealed room. My hands shook, sweat slick on my palms, but I pressed myself into the corner, bracing against the planks. The vibration followed me instantly, a new cadence, testing my boundaries, mapping my panic. I realized it wasn't the scream I should fear anymore. It was the silence between the screams. That was when the house acted. That was when it learned. That was when it decided who stayed and who, if given the chance, would never leave. Outside, the sun rose fully, indifferent. The town carried on. People walked the roads, carried groceries, argued over fences, completely unaware that the shape of their streets had begun to shift. The house wasn't finished, and it wouldn't be satisfied until it had defined the limits of what it could hold, including me. By the 10th night, the house had stopped behaving like a structure and started behaving like a predator. The scream no longer confined itself beneath the stairs. It followed me, not in sound, exactly, but in presence. Every step I took, every shift of weight, caused a subtle realignment, a ripple through the floorboards, a hum in the walls. I could feel it calculating, anticipating, measuring my size, my balance, the exact way I held my hands. I tried to barricade the door to the sealed room, extra nails, wedges of wood from the shed. Nothing worked. The vibration against the planks was immediate, violent, and sharp enough to jar my teeth. The wood flexed outward, as if pushing back, resisting my attempt to confine it. Then it happened. A section of the floor beneath the room shuddered violently. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. The planks bowed outward with such force that a gap appeared, wide enough to reveal a cavity I hadn't noticed before. Deeper, darker, as if the house had been hollowed out over centuries. And from it, a sound unlike anything before issued. Not a scream, not a howl, not yet. Something in between, a groaning, wet, hungry, deliberate. A sound that had rhythm, weight, intelligence. It echoed through the beams and walls, shaking the foundations, bending light in the corners of my vision. I stumbled back, heart hammering, aware suddenly that containment had failed. Whatever the scream had been before, a warning, a test, a training, was over. It had found a weakness. I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the house had never wanted me to hear it. It wanted me to interact with it, to be the part of it. My presence had been a variable, a lever, and now that lever had moved. The vibration shifted to the front hallway. The door I had walked through 100 times was trembling on its hinges, warping subtly, bending like it was breathing. I could hear wood stretching, nails squealing in protest. It wasn't just pressure, it was force. Something below the planks in the cavity had begun moving upward, slow, careful, measuring the resistance of floors and walls. The house groaned in concert. The scream still layered in the background as if it were cheering it on. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, but the house had other plans. My feet felt glued. Every doorway I approached pulled me backward, subtle, imperceptible resistance that forced me to pivot, to adjust, to delay. And then I saw it. A shadow pressed through the gap beneath the floorboards, not fully formed, not visible, but elongated, stretched, almost liquid. It moved with intent, rising, testing the air, measuring the space between the floor and ceiling. The screen surged once, violently, like a whip cracking against the walls. Dust flew, beams shifted, and in that instant, the house became clear. It was not just a building. It was a container, a conduit, a trainer, a trap, and the thing inside it had just begun to learn what it could do. By now the house had stopped pretending. Every room, every hallway, every board and beam seemed to pulse with anticipation. I could feel it in my bones, a constant, low-frequency vibration that synced with my heartbeat. The scream had become secondary. It was background noise, an indicator of focus rather than terror. The real danger was subtle, constant, patient. I returned to the sealed room beneath the stairs, more out of compulsion than bravery. The planks were bowed outward now, warped as if something beneath was pressing upward, testing the limits. The air smelled different, damp, iron-rich, like soil freshly turned. My hands grazed the floor and the walls, and I felt the faintest impressions, depressions, grooves, shallow divots where something had tried to rise but was pushed back. The ledger had warned of this stage indirectly, in cryptic phrases I hadn't appreciated before. It listens when you move, it measures when you breathe, it adjusts when you leave. I realized then that my presence was no longer optional, it was required. I left the room and walked slowly through the house, touching the door frames, walls, even the window sills, trying to trace the invisible paths the pressure followed, and then I heard it, a whisper, low and layered beneath the structural hum, as if the house itself was speaking through the vibration. Stay close. The sound wasn't external, it wasn't the scream, it came from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the ceiling, a message embedded in motion. I staggered to the hallway, heart hammering. Every step caused the vibration to shift slightly, like a mirror responding to movement. The hallway was narrower than it had been yesterday, the walls pressing inward subtly, almost imperceptibly. Outside I could hear faint movement. Wind? Perhaps, but no. Leaves rustled in patterns, unnatural, orchestrated. Something was coordinating beyond the house, stretching the pressure outward, testing limits. By the time night fully fell, the house had completed its lesson. The scream returned, but it was different. Sharper, focused, targeted. The vibration now pulsed in alignment with my exact position, anticipating movement, calculating how far I could step before resistance began. I realized, with dread settling like ice in my chest, that the house didn't just scream to warn. It screamed to train. It screamed to measure, and the walls themselves were documenting my responses, shaping me, conditioning me. The final entry in the ledger, nearly illegible, repeated over decades by those who had come before, echoed in my mind. Once chosen, you do not leave unmarked. And in the silence between screams, I understood fully what it meant. The house had chosen me. It was no longer a structure. It was a tutor, a trap, and I was its latest lesson. I don't remember deciding to leave. That's the part that unsettles me most when I try to reconstruct the end. There was no moment of resolve, no final glance back, no dramatic threshold crossing. The house did not resist when I gathered my things. It did not scream as I opened the front door. It simply allowed motion again. That should have frightened me more than anything. The vibration softened as I moved, like a grip loosening not out of defeat, but completion. The floorboards no longer adjusted beneath my steps. The walls stopped pressing inward. Even the sealed room beneath the stairs felt quiet, its pressure reduced to a dull, dormant weight, not gone, just resting. Outside, the air felt wrong, too light, as if sound itself had less substance beyond the house's perimeter. The trees were still, no wind, no birds. The world held its breath while I crossed the yard. When I reached the road, the scream returned one final time, not from behind me, from inside my chest. It was brief, controlled, almost instructional, a reminder rather than a threat. I didn't turn around. Weeks passed, then months. People asked why I left Union so abruptly. I gave them practical answers, structural concerns, family matters, opportunity elsewhere, all true in the most superficial sense. None of them asked why I never slept more than a few hours at a time, why I paused mid-sentence when rooms grew too quiet, why I preferred places with background noise, constant motion, living structures that shifted naturally instead of deliberately. The scream followed me, but not as sound. as pressure. In old buildings, I feel at first a subtle resistance in the air, a hesitation in the walls. In narrow hallways, I sense alignment, spaces adjusting just slightly to my presence, measuring, remembering. I no longer enter basements. I avoid houses with sealed rooms, blocked stairwells, false walls, not because I fear what's inside them, but because I recognize the architecture of restraint, the design of containment, the signature of something that was never destroyed, only trained. I dream of union sometimes, not the house as it was, but as it waits. Quiet, balanced, complete. I know now that the screaming house does not seek victims. It seeks participants, witnesses who understand pressure, alignment, patience, people who can carry its lessons elsewhere without realizing they're doing so. That ledger never left the house. It didn't need to, because the final warning was never written on paper. It was etched into those who survived long enough to listen. And every time a wall hums when I stand too close, every time a room seems to tighten just slightly around me, I know union is still teaching, just not from where it stands anymore.